I think educators and people who work in education have to understand their competition, because this is the attention economy. One of my favorite books I read was by Tim Wu, and he talks about the attention economy, and this idea that like, we all know this, the internet is driven by advertising. And so the more time you spend on it, the more ads you can sell, right? That's public knowledge. So educational material, right, is not seeing themselves as media companies. And that's what needs to change. Like, education has to think like exec producers who are trying to keep people watching their show, right? You are competing against, the shade room. You're competing against, these really highly engaged, platform. So that to me is something I'm trying to reframe in my work. Like, how do we make it sticky? How do we, compete against some of these other entertainment, IP generators?
Hey, Gerald, thanks for coming on today. Appreciate you being on the show. And so I'm excited to discuss your career journey and the way that you got to both Google and YouTube. And I want those that are listening to really walk away with a much deeper appreciation for the creative process and that intersection between creativity and technology. As we were sort of mentioning before, there are many different paths into technology, and I'm excited to hear how that creative process and that creative knack inside each and every one of us has some place in any technology company. So super excited.
Same. Thank you for having me.
Great. So tell us where you currently live and what you're currently working on at the moment.
For sure. So my name is Gerald Jean-Baptiste. I'm from Miami, Florida. I'm Haitian American. Right now I live in Los Angeles, California. I work at YouTube. I'm a video producer for our support channels, focusing on content for the YouTube viewers channel. And I have a series called Amplify Voices on the YouTube creators channel, where I interview underrepresented creators about their journey on YouTube. I'm also the co-founder of Move Up Lift Up, a creative consulting company with another Caribbean American person in tech, Kyle Gordon. He's currently at MIT studying his MBA.
Okay.
And so,
nice.
Super excited about that. We've got a lot of things going on.
And I forgot to mention, you are our first guest from the country of Haiti. So way to represent. Appreciate you coming on.
Now I'm excited, man. I'm excited to represent.
Great. And how did you sort of choose to work where you work currently?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think it really starts for me in high school. So I got into filmmaking when I was in high school because I did drama. And, I went to a predominantly Haitian American high school in North Miami Beach, which is part of the Little Haiti diaspora. If you're not familiar with Miami, Miami has like, very much a couple quintessential Haitian neighborhoods, Little Haiti, which I taught there, North Miami Beach. And we didn't have a lot of access to a lot of like high-end equipment, high-end stuff. So for me, my interest in creativity was centered around the stage, around acting. And then my drama teacher exposed me to filmmaking boot camps, and I found internships. And, for me, the biggest barrier to filmmaking was the access to technology I had. We had one maybe computer that could edit. I couldn't have one at home that was powerful enough. So I had to, go to an internship 2 hours away where I could, use their, in exchange for working for them, use their stuff. And, and I was able to use their stuff to essentially shoot my thesis film that got me into NYU, and so, but I just saw how technology, like whether it was the newest Final Cut Pro, whether it was having the camera, all these things, the barrier to entry was really high, for what I wanted to do. And I also saw that, like, for me, there were so many things I wanted to watch. Like there was so many, I remember this was 2007. I was a senior in high school in 2007, where, Netflix existed, but it was DVDs, right? And so just the access to watching cinema, watching these things. And so the story I always tell people, when I was a kid, we used to bootleg our cable, and so we got the Stars channel, the Stars movie channel and Encore. And I remember, because, basic cable is cool, but like, it gets boring really quickly. So I remember, like by 7 years old, I was watching these really experimental art house films, and I didn't know what they were about. I couldn't follow the plot line, but I just remember being really captivated by them and watching them 5-10 times, and because, we have strict Caribbean parents. So, going back to the Caribbean aspect, you just can't be walking around outside, without supervision, just walking, doing, especially in Miami. And so, the TV became my escape. And, that's when I understood the power of media as a role of bringing knowledge, empowering. So it was almost like a visual encyclopedia for me. And so this how this ties to where I'm at now. YouTube is like, if I had YouTube, as a kid, I would just be there's so much expansive knowledge I would take. Like I watch, documentaries for fun. I'm a very curious person. And so those cable channels that I bootleg were my kind of foray, into, new mediums. And so I had a really deep respect for how technology created access for media. I understood that at a young age. And like, I was like, okay, this is precious. This is like very special. How do I continue to get access to that? So I just knew I had to be in places that like respected technology so I can, use media in that way.
Shout out to you driving 2 hours to get access to a computer to produce film. That's respect.
Oh, thank you. No, and it was important because my senior year, I knew I wanted to go to NYU. I was like, hey, if I'm so going back to the Caribbean, studying the arts is such a risk, in our culture. My older brother, Levinsky Jean-Baptiste, he's an actor. He's recently, if you watch Startup, I don't know if you've seen Startup.
The series?
Startup, the series, okay. Netflix series. He's in there, JJ. He's one of the characters, and it's about Miami and about technology. He's been an actor for the past 20 years. He went to UCLA for his master's, and so seeing him kind of pursue that career field was something that's so outside of the norm for a lot of Caribbean folks.
Right.
He gave me the inspiration, but I said, hey, I have to go to one of the best schools to do this. If I'm going to take this risk, I really have to go to the best. And so I committed to say, hey, if I don't get into NYU, or to USC, like I'm not going to study film. And so I was like, what's the bar, for me? And so I spent the summer before, doing an internship, doing a film camp, and I was able to collect resources. I spent 2 weeks washing cars to get money to help do my film. I got all my friends from drama class, and this is pretty much relates to what I do now. I'm a producer, right? Like I figure out how to make things happen in the creative process, and I find the technology and the pieces to put it together. And so
now you have a bigger budget.
Exactly, right. And the Caribbean scrappiness too, man. That's what really got me the drive, like the hard work, which is part of our culture, which I think is something that my mom's worked 7 days a week for 50 years, and so really take all that in.
Yeah, I think that's one other aspect I don't necessarily hear much people speak about, and I would say especially the Haitian community, this notion of grinding and hard work over long periods of time. And shout out to the parents, from the Caribbean region who sacrifice a lot for their kids. I know I wouldn't be here without all the sacrifices of my parents. So it's kind of wanted to highlight that as well, right?
No, and it's important to acknowledge that because my mom and dad came in 1985. My father passed when I was 5, and so my mom raised 5 of us. Single parent. She's not able to read and write fully because in Haiti she wasn't allowed to go to school. I think machismo and patriarchy is something to also talk about in our cultures, but it wasn't seen a value for her to go to school. But she's very smart, very, very strong, and very much had a vision for our family, when we moved to Miami. And so, worked 2 jobs, worked in public schools, being a janitor, being a cleaning lady, just seeing, like, I saw how hard she worked. And I knew that I was the first generation who had the opportunity to go to college. So I wasn't going to, just go to school and not do anything, right? Like there had to be a purpose, so that work ethic and the pressure, of like accomplishing something for my family is something that really sits with me,
Yeah. So basically, I guess maybe phrased a different way is your parents didn't have much when they were growing up. And I guess probably similarly to my parents as well. And they achieved X. So now given that you have way much more than your parents, you have to achieve way more than essentially they have, right?
Yeah. And I went to Haiti in 2012 for the first time after the earthquake. The earthquake, obviously, in 2010, the 2010 earthquake, because we're talking about multiple earthquakes, really impacted me. And I felt like I had to do something. And I still have family there. I have my uncle and, cousins. And, I went to do service there through the organization called Haitian American Caucus. And I went my senior year of college. And I realized that, wow, like, I'm seeing my family in Kafou, in Port-au-Prince, and, the struggles they're going through. And I'm graduating from one of the best schools in the world. Like, I have to have a deep responsibility. And that's kind of what drove me to go teach in Little Haiti after, to really serve my community.
Just that big dichotomy of worlds, essentially, right? Great. And we do the show to encourage people from the Caribbean region and hopefully, more people from Haiti get to see representation within yourself to pursue these things called data-driven careers. However, being data-driven tends to lead to very linear thinking. So my covered piano behind me was purchased simply because I realized my brain is deficient on the creative side, and I needed to expand. Not necessarily saying that I do expand on that particular piece of equipment, but let's leave that aside. I have access. And I imagine the role of creativity is extremely important for your particular career. Can you share with us your view of how you think tech, machine learning, but more so the intersection of human creativity will play a role in the Caribbean's future?
Oh my God, I'm so glad you asked that. And I would say in my background too, I have an interesting intersection of, STEM and creativity. So I was in middle and high school in a science technology magnet program, for all, 7 years where I had to do advanced mathematics, advanced sciences. And so that was like, I was going to be on that path because like most Caribbean people, you're going to be, engineer, doctor, whatever, right? You're going to go into those fields, right? That's the expectation. So I was studying on that. But I had a huge, creative personality and interest, et cetera. But I always respected the sciences in a deep way and that type of thinking. So I understood that like you had to respect both. So it was really interesting for me going to college with that mindset. And just, I think it's how I approach my filmmaking work as a producer. I'm very strategic in that way. But I think to me, the intersection of media, culture, and technology is like my career thesis. I believe that, and there's a great documentary called Gods, Robots, and Technology that you should check out on YouTube. It's amazing. It's amazing. I'll forward it to you after. And pretty much the whole thesis is that, technology is built by the engineers, but it's propagated by the kind of religious institutions, the personalities, the people who have the capture in the ear of the people, right? And you see that now, right? Instagram would not be what it is without its top influencers, right? Without Black communities who make it popular. And they actually shape the platform, like literally the usage and the trends that people and product can see shape how the product will be designed moving forward, right? So you can't separate the creativity and the technology because essentially the creativity is what makes it sticky, right? And so from the beginning of my time, so I think let's back up a little bit. I studied film and television at NYU, and I was always, technology was part of the filmmaking process. I remember just new cameras, new this, like how can these things kind of impact that? How can you find shortcuts to that? Like, so, I was surprised how much technology was part of my filmmaking education, and I think the first time I had access to more technology being at NYU, in a way that like I didn't have before. And then I did education. I taught for 2 years in Miami, but I went to the Harvard Graduate School of Education where I studied arts and education. And I took some of my favorite classes, but one of the best classes I've ever took in my academic career was Growing Up in a Media World by Joe Black. And so it's a whole class that observes how kids growing up right now in this kind of center of media, how does that impact their educational outcomes and how can it be used to kind of shape, educational tools? So I learned from people like who created Sesame Street, right? And so Sesame Street, like literally, and Joe Black's one of the kind of founding members of that, was a scaled education resource using technology. So in the 70s, you have the television, right? And you have this issue where literacy is a huge problem, especially for Black, impoverished kids. So they don't have access to pre-K. They don't have access to these things, that will kind of, get them the literacy they need to go into kindergarten. So they'd be like, hey, let's create a content show that's going to help kind of, do this, but let's do it in a scaled way through television. And so now you have the Sesame Workshop, et cetera. And so what that really started to connect for me is, technology provides scale to help solve problems, right? And so I started to realize at Harvard that technology had to be a key part of my kind of theory of change through filmmaking. And because like for me, filmmaking, storytelling, and education are on the same plane for me. Like that is my why, to tell stories. And I'm like, oh, the medium is going to be kind of driven through technology. So that's kind of what drove me to say, hey, I think I want to work at a tech company. And I think the other thing that happened is I interned at HBO Sports in 2010 when I was at NYU. And they brought all the interns into a room one time. And they're like, hey, how are you watching HBO? So this is before the apps, before we had HBO Now and all that. And we're like, oh, we're all bootlegging it. We're not paying for it. And they're like, oh, interesting. And then a couple years later, they dropped the app, right? And I think what I took away is like they foresaw that like the audiences, and because, we're like the future professional adults, right? They realized that like technology was going to be part of it. And I saw the growth of Netflix. I just understood that technology was going to be a shape for this. And then so going into a tech company, I really, really saw how much that, all the media platforms were going to funnel through technology, either through advertising, subscription, just knowing your audiences, et cetera. And so that's kind of shaped my career path. And I think the capstone event where I really showcased, this idea and concept was this event I did called Google SoulFest.
Yes.
I did Google SoulFest in 2018. Me and Kyle Gordon, we co-produced it. And it was something we did as a whole side project, where we had a Google hardware and Google research and machine learning sponsor the event. And it was a whole commentary on the intersection of Black arts, culture, and technology. And we had a series of panels. We had performances. It was at the Paramount Theater in Oakland. It was headlined by Her and No Name right before they blew up. So we caught them right before they blew up. Elaine Wolfroth hosted. We had panels with MC Hammer, Chameleonaire, Morgan Aban from Blavity, Ghazi from Empire, and all these people who were asking the same questions of like, hey, as artists, we are shaping technology, right? We are impacting the platform, but we're not on the seats of the platform. So we wanted the artists to be next to the engineer and the product leaders to say, hey, because there is this imbalance. There is this kind of separate rooms that they're living in, right? Where technology platforms are building these things and they don't even understand how it would be used, right? They're not talking to artists to understand, because a word in technology and product companies that you hear a lot is engagement, which is another word for stickiness, like usage, right? Things that are interesting and creative drive that, right? And so when you talk to people who like literally their job is how to keep people engaged, which are artists, creatives, culture makers. If you talk to them and you say, hey, if we build this thing for you, right? This thing on this platform, will you use it? How will you use it? Oh, we can, if we do this thing. So these are the conversations we want to spark. And we wanted to bring people in the community who normally didn't have access to technology to just have them use it. Just what will happen when you kind of have that intersection happen. And I think the canonical example I use of how we need to reframe creatives as technologists is the DJ. So look at the creation of hip hop. You have in the early 70s, you have the New York City blackout, right? And you also have at the time the decline of public school budgets, where a lot of kids were engaging in the creative arts in school. So those programs are removed. So these kids don't have access to that. The blackout happens. You see mass, looting and break-ins where people are taking mixers from these like electronic stores.
I see.
They're now they're now using these turntables, right, to then create and take records and create breaks between them to create a new kind of looping sound, right? And they're manipulating, they're literally hacking technology and creating a culture out of it, right? Which now spawns not only a music art form, right, but then a fashion, right? You have like mentality, work, like all these different things, right? And so I want like a big thing for us how to reframe, like looking at DJ as like a true technologist, right? Because I mean, there is a technology aspect of it. If you watch the Get Down, to me, it was amazing. It was a study on creativity and technology. And so to say all that, like that's my life's work. Like, how do we center creatives in technology? Because once creators are centered, then you're gonna have true like a new set of innovation with technology. I think in so many ways.
So with that being said, that was a lot of stuff in there. Okay. When it comes to people in the Caribbean region, and one of the things that you highlighted when you were growing up was this lack of access to technology, in which you could not express certain creative energies that you had. Now, within, let's say, the Haitian region or the region of the community, most people to some degree might have iPhones, they'll have Android phones, fairly decent camera. And I think a video camera is one medium of expression. Even just a voice recording is probably another medium of expression as well. What would you say, given that people have access to better technology that, let's say, you did back in your days?
For sure.
What do you think is kind of going to happen?
No, I think that's a great question. I think what you're talking about is like, there's more access to kind of like more, not as powerful means of like content communication, like, high-end cameras, et cetera. But everyone has something. Everyone has a camera. Everyone has ability to record, right? I think this is why like these platforms like TikTok and IG are, are really, really special, right? But I would actually kind of reference my experience in Cuba. So I studied abroad in Cuba for 3 months. I studied documentary filmmaking in Cuba in 2011 through NYU, and it was, to me, I think, another formative experience from obviously my creativity, because I don't know if you've been to Havana or Cuba. It's a very, very artistic and creative place. But how they have to use technology is so innovative because there's limited bandwidth, right? And so, internet is very expensive, right? A lot of people have phones, but maybe, again, it's like low-end phone, et cetera. It's similar problems as you can see in the Caribbean, where literally the bandwidth issue is a whole nother like complicated thing, right? Where like cell phone service, et cetera. But, they use flash drives to pass around media. So they call it paquetas, where someone in Miami will download all of scrape all of Netflix and all these things. And like, I remember I would get things from them. I'm like, how do you get this, right? And so there's this kind of a sharing of technology in this different capacity, right? Where you're getting people kind of downloading essentially the internet and passing it literally physically around, and people buy it every week to get access to content. And I'm saying that to say that like these type of innovative solutions, I think, are really interesting beyond just like, I think there's something that even American technologists can learn from things like this that are happening in place like Cuba, around like, hey, how can we create more access? You're seeing this with like YouTube Lite, where like there's like a kind of low, like a version of YouTube which allows people with low bandwidth to use it, which the
I didn't realize that was out.
Yeah. So like it's a big thing for India, a lot of developing countries, where you can just have a low bandwidth version of that, where people can go, because I'm assuming you already know this, but like when people go to Wi-Fi, they download everything they want to watch and use, and then they leave, right? And so technology solutions like that, as far as consumption, is something that's happening. But as far as creation, I think yes, things like cell phone cameras are really awesome, and I think things like TikTok, et cetera. But I think one of the things still that's missing for me is like the studio spaces and the creativity spaces for them to flourish, right? And so I think that's one thing that, like, yes, like I really believe that the access of and the proliferation of like phones is great and cameras is great, because people are experimenting, but I still want to see a studio, across different places in the Caribbean, where people can expand their ideas in a big way. That's why I want to live in LA. I want to see the business of entertainment. So that's why carnivals are just a great example of just these huge expressions of creativity in the Caribbean, right? And how do we capture that? How do we, encapsulate that in culture in so many different ways is what I want to see more of, right? Because I just think I don't want us to be limited to just a a camera phone, right? To only capture our culture, right? Like that's kind of where I'm at. Where like because I think some of the most richest part of global culture exists in the Caribbean, because it's this beautiful mix of West African, European and indigenous cultures that are coming together. I don't want it to be limited at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that actually does make a lot of sense. And I didn't necessarily even focus on it's the representation aspect, right?
Yes.
The name of the show is Caribbean Data Science Podcast. And for instance, if we don't bring on guests, let's say, that work at top companies, people at home might not necessarily understand, hey, here's kind of the real benchmark everywhere else. Here's the possibility of expression, essentially. And that's what you're sort of getting at there.
No, because I used to work on the Netflix account, selling advertisements, and I was seeing the kind of foray into Africa and their foray into these places. And, they struggle because they don't know the lifetime value of these customers, right? The access to technology is hard. The pricing is hard. All these things are hard. So there's an assumption, hey, we cannot monetize these audiences, right? So then they don't deserve the newest things. They don't deserve not saying that they don't want to give it to them. They don't understand the value of them, right? And I think part of that is because there's not the same means of creative production there, right? To be able to showcase the value of that, right? And I think that's something that gap needs to switch. And you've seen that with like Afrobeats. You're seeing that with some of these cultures where people are realizing how rich the cultures are. That like, oh, this is going to drive so many other things too. So that's one of my big goals in my career.
So I wanted to hop back into some of your career journey. You studied arts. You decided, all right, I'm going to make this decision. I'm going to go into arts, but there's this recognition that there's a technology layer inherent in this creative process, that without such a technology layer, the true value of the creativity is possibly limited to some degree.
Yes.
And with that in mind, you got so many internships. Is there anything else you can tell us what you learned from there, but also the process of how you got those internships? So just a quick story aside, probably folks that listen a lot would have heard the story already, but I only got my first internship in the last year of my PhD, right? So this is almost 10 to 11 years into that formal education process, not for lack of trying, but that's just kind of how the cards fell for me. But during your undergrad, you were able to have 3 of them as I looked up. So
no, that's right.
what was your approach to getting them?
Yeah, I know this goes back to the Caribbean work ethic part, like, hey, you're gonna go study the arts, you make sure you better have a job when you graduate, right? But I think also I was part of a scholarship program called the Martin Luther King Jr. Scholars, that was instrumental. When I got into NYU, I couldn't afford it. I didn't have enough scholarship, and at the time they weren't really giving out a lot of full scholarships. So, I called the office, kind of saying, hey, this is my dream school. I dream to get in here. Like, what can you do? And they're like, hey, we're sorry, there's nothing we can do. And that persistence, my college counselors like, hey, just keep calling them. And they put me in the pool for the Martin Luther King Jr. Scholarship. And what was funny is I had never been to New York before getting into NYU. I was just going to go to New York line. And so they flew me up for scholarship weekend. And part of that scholarship was obviously getting additional scholarship money. But you got to travel. Like I got to travel outside the country for the first time. But then also you got a stipend for a summer internship. And so that helped give me the first summer internship, which was at this place called Irgu that did like sound design. And again, just seeing like, hey, like, oh, like there's these huge technology kind of backends that help just do the sound design for major network shows. Like that's literally their kind of like thing. I'm like, oh, like that's a whole business in itself, right? So just seeing like the part of the entertainment process and how technology plays a role in that. And that on my resume kind of helped set me up to get another internship, which was at Spike Lee's filmmaking company, 40 Acres and a Mule, which, Spike Lee's for me, just like my like big inspirations and kind of guides for my life. And I was able to then also get an internship at HBO Sports where, I worked in the documentary department where I was doing research for them and just seeing how like a big media conglomerate and learning about technology and seeing that. And so I also interned at the Source magazine where I was kind of doing video content for, at their time, their website, and so again, I'm seeing technology kind of play this role in kind of all the things that I'm doing. And I think especially for the internships, I think a big part of it for me was experimentation, right? Like, hey, what part of the processes of the media world do I want to, and technology world do I want to touch, and getting the opportunity to do it. Being in New York was one of the big privileges, so I could do an internship throughout the year and get that experience. I think another big part of internships for me was building the network, that's necessary to really get a job and get it. Because a lot of these fields, so much about is like who you know. So I think just some of that relationship aspect of it was really important. But I think a big thing for me was just the confidence of like, yeah, like if I'm interning at these places, I'm like, I'm literally seeing Spike Lee. I'm really seeing, I'm at a boxing fight for HBO Sports. I'm shooting concerts for the Source magazine, just realizing, I can be in this world, because, again, saying to yourself, hey, I want to be a producer and a filmmaker, like can feel like fantasy land, before. And so I think some of the big things I would say for internships for the audience is like, it really gives you the belief that, hey, I can do this, and that can be part of my life and journey.
So you're a hustler.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
What's interesting is, I have another friend who's kind of a mentor, and he just said, yeah, you should be hustling all the time. And he's kind of known as, sort of, we call him the king hustler. And I'm pretty happy to hear that your persistence definitely paid off. So for those that are listening, no matter the algorithms that or the math that blah, 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 there's no sort of substitute for that.
None.
Undeniable grit.
Yeah.
Great. And one of the things, so you did some teaching at some point, right? After, I believe it's after some of your internships, and you went to teach. And I think you went back to some underperforming schools in Miami, right? Yep. And kind of tell us about that. And one of the reasons I wanted to highlight that particular part of your journey is, I think technology is so important for putting up guardrails for people, especially in underrepresented areas. And how do you sort of see both the culture, but also the culture and technology guiding their new journeys to especially break the molds of careers that exist
Yes.
now?
Ooh. Yes, I have a lot of opinions about that. So I went to public schools my whole life, and that was a huge impact on me. I went to my neighborhood public schools too, and that had a huge impact on me too. From a young age, I knew education was important. Growing up in Caribbean culture, education is the central part of what you grow up with. But I think for me, the reason I did Teach for America specifically, I only wanted to do Teach for America in Miami. I was like,
Okay.
hey, I wanted to teach in Little Haiti, where I'm from, because I believe that like kids from Little Haiti seeing a teacher from Little Haiti who's young. Like I was 22 when I started teaching. I was teaching high school. Like we'll create a lot of aspirational kind of like goals for them, and they can see themselves in the future. Like I mean, people thought I was a student there, but I taught at Miami Edison Senior High School. I taught English language learners, so a lot of kids just coming from Haiti. And so for me, because again, I went to Haiti in 2012, and I taught in Little Haiti in 20. I went to Haiti in Port-au-Prince in 2012 at the beginning of the year, and then I went to go teach that year. I was so moved by that experience. I was like, I have to do something. Like I could have worked in corporate media. I had a job opportunity to stay in New York, work in media, but I
Wow.
wouldn't feel complete. There was a part of that calling of just like, hey, there's a part of me that needs to serve my community, directly, and just also personally, just struggling with, being Haitian but growing up in America, and that part of it. And I think for me, there was so much resolution around my identity by that experience, because I realized like I'm part of the Caribbean diaspora, I'm part of the Haitian diaspora. Like that is part of who I am. Like that is, you can't separate that. And I think the experience of teaching in Little Haiti for me was so important to that, and so transformational. It was the hardest job I'll ever have still to this day. But I think there's so much I took away from the experience that I always say I got more out of it than I could ever give those students. But and I think in relation to technology, and I think again, I did my master's degree right after, was during those 3 years of teaching for 2 years and then doing a master's at Harvard in arts and education. I really understood that my time in the classroom with them, that 90 minutes to 2 hours, was very much a limited time. There was so much education happening for them through their phones, through the time on the desktop, and they needed much more time in education to do that. So I really started to believe in this concept of scaled education, which is kind of what I do now. Like I create educational videos for YouTube, which people can watch. But I realized that it was gonna. If you think about it in technology terms, like that's a very, if you think about the at bats, right, the opportunities for learning, right? If I teach a kid maybe 2 times to 3 times a week for 90 minutes, right, and I can only do a 1-to-20 or 1-to-30 ratio of opportunity, that's not like a really good hit rate to be effective, right? So like maybe I have, out of 10 opportunities, I have 2 good lessons, that are really good, that really like kind of like are solid, right? And maybe by the 5th time I got the lesson right. And then so it's inconsistent, right? The inconsistency around the effectiveness is very low, right? Not saying that in-person education, it matters a lot, but I just understood that to ensure, especially kids who are coming from under-resourced backgrounds. I'm having kids who are in high school at a 3rd grade reading level, 2nd grade reading level, 5th grade reading level, all just across the board, who I'm trying to make them pass a 10th grade state exam, right? Because they're going to go out into the world in a year. And
That's
so like
crazy.
the efficiency has to be way higher, and I need more tries, right? And so this is where, to me, I saw technology being a really key piece of like increasing the efficiency rate of in-person instruction, because and making it interesting and sticky, where they want to do this outside of work, because they're on Facebook outside of school. They're watching music videos, they're creating, they're doing these things. So how can we infuse educational opportunities and those other things to increase our efficiency rate for technology? And was what I started to realize, where like we have to make learning interesting, captivating, right, fun, right? And that's, to me, was the thing I always loved about filmmaking. Was like, hey, I want to make this a learning opportunity, but fun and interesting, because that's going to be the only way I think to close the achievement gap, is by capturing the time outside from 9 to 2, really going in from 2 to 10 o'clock. You know what I'm
Yes.
saying? Is how we're going to be successful.
There was a quote I heard from someone that said the access to learning materials is not limited. It is the desire to learn that is sort of limited. And that's modulo, I guess, very, very remote regions that have no access to technology. But I guess even in America, all across the Caribbean, if you have a phone, access to the internet, to some degree, you have access to all body of knowledge. And yeah, so it's interesting.
But I think the hard part is that and this is why technology for youth is such a complex issue, is that we're competing with very highly engaging platforms. Like again, YouTube has a bunch of educational material, but it has a bunch of non like garbage, right? Or things that are just really just meant to like fry your brain too, right? That are super engaging, right? That keep you on. Same thing with it. I think educators and people who work in education have to understand their competition, because this is the attention economy. One of my favorite books I read was by Tim Wu, and he talks about the attention economy, and this idea that like, we all know this, the internet is driven by advertising. And so the more time you spend on it, the more ads you can sell, right? That's public knowledge. So educational material, right, is not seeing themselves as media companies. And that's what needs to change. Like education has to think like exec producers who are trying to keep people watching their show, right? You are competing against, the shade room. You're competing against, these really highly engaged, platform. So that to me is something I'm trying to reframe in my work. It's like, how do we make it sticky? How do we, compete against some of these other entertainment, IP generators?
But in something you just said, that means that teachers at home. So for instance, at least when I was growing up in high school, you were doing extra lessons after school. And it was by sometimes the same teacher that teaches you in class, which was kind of interesting. And I think there's also opportunity for those teachers to innovate and also spread their audience, locally, right? So it's just almost, I don't want to say hyper local, but just outside of local or same regional type of influence that they can have by looking or treating themselves as a educational production company almost, right?
Yes. And again, I have a lot of friends who are still in education because again, I did Teach America. I have a lot of friends who are there, and it's interesting seeing, and my partner works at a creative tech company that does Skillshare, that does education, and I think when teachers start seeing themselves as talent, like let's just use the entertainment words, like, hey, you are talent, right? And you are delivering a performance. It changes and now principals are really like producers, right? And you have the stage, and you have, again, all these people who are behind the scenes who are making it happen. Because, if you can have the best, like, listen, some of my best lessons, I wish I could record them and share that. Like, instead of me having to try to figure out, let me get the takes, right? Think about takes, right? If I have my fifth take is the best one, right? And I'm the best, math teacher, right? At teaching this particular type of algebra lesson. Why can't we scale that? One of the best talks I went to was this thing around Harvard X. And he talked this guy, I forgot the professor's name, but he said, like, with scaled education, we can now maximize the efficiency of a teacher, right? Because we can get the best lesson, right? We can get the best teacher to teach that thing, and we can scale that out. And then it doesn't mean that the in-person instruction is stopped, but now the best way to explain something is now given by that person. Now the teacher can really focus on,
those deltas, right, that exist with each student.
Exactly, right. But again, that's approaching it from a production standpoint versus like just a traditional education standpoint.
I like that analogy. I never really thought about, because teaching is a big passion of mine as well, and especially for students that I don't think learn like everyone else. They just read a book and they know it, or the teacher says something and they know it. I think I was probably one of those students that you had to read, you had to listen, I think at some point in one of my math classes, I was literally singing, I was rapping theorems in order to remember it, because it just didn't make sense to me any other way. And this was just out of pure desperation, because if I failed that class, I was pretty much getting deported. So I was like, okay, I need to figure out how to learn this thing. And with that being said, there's this, when it comes to culture, right? And I kind of want to shift into this notion of culture and technology. And something that I think is not necessarily expressed a lot, especially in career development or career coaching when you're in school, is, hey, pay attention to the culture of a company when you get there. So can you kind of tell us, how did you pick up on different cultures as you sort of went through before you got to Google?
Yeah, as in company cultures, right? And just like different kind of
fun. There's the culture that you bring as a person into a company culture, and there's like your culture, your company cultural lineage that you have from all the companies or internships that you've worked at.
No, I totally get that. No, I'm glad, because I think this is tying to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think just how belonging is a big part of a mission that we're hearing a lot of, and how that role that plays. And so funny because like for me, that's like really important, right? So like, being Caribbean, like family structure is a big thing, right? Like you have to like how you operate with family and community is a big part of the work that you do. So, when I was at NYU, like, again, I was part of a group of students, a collective that's, started the Black Student Union, that was involved in the Caribbean Students Union, Haitian American Student Association, like where we created these courts and families to navigate predominantly white institutions. And I just understood that like this was going to be my method of success, was going to be through doing communities, doing events for our, the community, et cetera, and working together. And similarly, I think that kind of traveled to each of the institutions I went to, because I understood that there's so much against us as far as like this institution isn't set up for us to be successful, so we have to kind of dictate how to make it successful for us, right? So I think that attitude of not waiting for it to come to us, but to be proactive. Same thing with Teach for America. I started a collective of Black educators called Ujima, where we were like, hey, like how we're getting professionally developed and trained, we're not being assessed fairly. We're having lower retention rates. Like how can we advocate for ourselves better? At Harvard, I was part of the Alumni of Color, community and council. But to me, I think at Google, the biggest example for me of that, what you're talking about, was the Black Googler Network, which is, I think, how we met.
Yes.
We hosted the event with Gerald Jean, and saying like, hey, we need to host more events and do more things that really center our experiences. So for me, like, if I'm going to be at one of the most powerful companies in the world, in the history of the world, arguably, and I'm not advocating for my stories, the experiences of my people, and in working together with other people who look like me that are here, that's a huge wasted opportunity. Like I just couldn't sit with myself to know that, especially getting my cultural heritage of like community, family. Like to me, I bring that to any space I go, right? That's just part, and I think that's why a lot of people enjoy working with me, because I have a collectivist mindset, but that comes from my Caribbean culture. But there is this clash, I would say, around, especially in tech companies, that around meritocracy, around just kind of, there's a kind of coldness that can kind of exist around just how we approach like lack of a kind of emotional expression. I think is something too that like I think is something that like can be like a challenge, right? And I think for a lot of people, why they struggle, especially Black people and people from African diaspora struggle sometimes at tech companies, is, I think culturally there's values that come that are not for us, right? Like that don't feel like us, but we need to be in these spaces, right? Because these spaces make so much of the decision. So one of the things I'm always working on is how do we also create the space for these people to thrive, just to be here? I think, there's a world in which we'll have our own technology platforms, we'll have and own our own things, but for right now, right, in the interim, we need to be here in all phases of these companies, from a technical perspective, from a marketing perspective, from a communication. Like, I want all of us to be in all these places influencing these things. So how do people are there to thrive is kind of one of my big goals, because us being in the room matters, and so I think culturally, and I think another thing I did, I used to host was called the new Google orientation, called Noogler orientation.
Okay.
Yeah, I was kind of one of the MCs, and I compared, Google culture to Sunday dinner with my mom. My mom would cook a big Haitian feast every Sunday. And, we have all hands at Google called TGIF, where people come get food and people come together and celebrate culture. And, growing up Caribbean, like, these moments of gathering of food and all that, that's a big part of our narrative, right? Like coming home and, when I come home to Miami, just like, hey, yes, you sit down, you have a feast, you talk, you spend time, you make sure you talk to everyone in the family. These kind of cultural norms can exist in this field too, can exist in this way too. And I think that's something that we should continue to advocate for. I think a lot of times, again, I've brought a lot of Caribbean and African-American food vendors for events, and just to make sure that, hey, we can be here, right? It's something that I think is really important. That we're not invisible here.
And just broadening the definition overall of what is the norm, essentially, right?
Yep.
So tell us how you kind of got to Google, right? I imagine you as a young person growing up, Netflix kind of makes sense, I guess. Probably when YouTube came out, you're like, oh yeah, that would be a kind of cool company to work for. Yeah. But probably not necessarily Google, I would say, for a film person, right?
Yeah, no, it was an interesting decision. It was an interesting time in my life. I was 25, and so it's actually really funny. I was at Harvard, and I remember someone on LinkedIn reached out to me randomly, about, hey, are you interested in applying at roles at Google? And I thought it was like spam. This isn't real. Like, you don't really want to talk to me. Like, so I ignored it. I ignored it for a year.
Oh no
like,
way! A whole year.
Yeah, a whole year. I was just like, this isn't real. I just, whatever. And then I was interested in looking some other roles, and I reached out, and literally that person responded to me the same day,
That's
and say, hey,
crazy.
like, let's talk on Monday. And for me, coming from education, like the roles that were available to me were in human resources. And
Mm-hmm.
I love people. I love working with people, and I knew that technology was always going to be of interest to me in some capacity. It's like, hey, like, what's my way in, right? And so for me, like, I was like, hey, like, you can do essentially, I was a talent headhunter when I
Mm-hmm.
came in. I was like, hey, this is my opportunity, to kind of really break in and see and have a new experience. At 25, there's so much to explore. And at the time, and so I think here's another thing that people don't realize. In 2014, 2015, the conversation of inclusion really started to become a thing where Google and other tech companies started to disclose the numbers, because they were like, hey, there's only white and Asian guys, for the most part, working here. Like, what's going on here? Like, how can you guys diversify? And so there was this big rush, I would say from 2015 to 2018 to really hire a lot of underrepresented folks, right? And so I was
Mm-hmm.
caught up in that wave where that aggressive hiring spree. And I was also someone who was doing that too when I got to Google.
Okay.
And for me, that was really important because I came to understand, the role in which having people there and in the room, and how, like, I think we need to shape, the development and the education of people in technology, because the big thing was, are enough people studying technology who grew up in these areas, like, et cetera. And so for me, that became something where I realized, like, hey, we really have to address the education piece around this.
Mm-hmm.
From there, I did intern events and programs. And so again, just continuing to do education, but from a more experiential standpoint, to make sure that, a group of MBA and undergraduates can find success in tech companies, and
Yes.
convert tech companies. And then I knew I always wanted to work in media. Like, that was always the goal. And like, I just say, hey, get my foot in the door, and then I'll figure it out from there. I made the transfer to sales, where I worked on the Netflix and Hulu account,
Mm-hmm.
where I learned so much, so much. I mean, these are such innovative media companies, and just seeing how they operate, just seeing how they work, learned so much. And I was selling YouTube to them, and just really getting a sense of, oh, how, I think media works at scale. And then, I miss being creative. Like, I was, throughout my whole time, I was doing creative side projects, and I was like, hey, I want to do this in my role. And so I came across a video producer role at YouTube, which, just really lucky. And it's been great. I've been in there for a year, but I've been at Google for almost 6 years. And I think it's one of the great things that, being at a big company, there's so many opportunities. So I almost feel like I've continued to reinvent myself here,
Yes.
and I think I still have the stability of, like, being at the same company, having the same email, growing with the company. I think for me has been a real blessing. And I have a lot of great mentors there. And I think it's rare. Like, most millennials, bounce between jobs every 2 to 3 years. And, I've technically have done that, but I've just stayed at the same company. So I think, to me,
Just
that's one of the,
moved.
just move. And I still see a lot of growth for me here.
I wanted to make sure that at least I would say, I don't want to say the younger generation. I guess from an HR perspective, you can't say, you're not allowed to say younger. That's something everyone was listening in school. If you get to work, you can't say young.
Yeah.
Um, is, hey, how do I break in? And a question that at least a lot of people ask me is, hey, how do I break into data science? How do I become a data engineer or become a data analyst? And oftentimes I'm like, go through the back door. And I think your story is perfect, such that you wanted to be in media with that creative thing, but you're like, oh, I'm just gonna be an HR
Yep.
representative and scout great talent from underrepresented groups and build my network from there. And one thing I don't think you've called out, which I'm only seeing, I think, because I've done it or I've tried to do it, not necessarily to the scale that you have, is organizing events. I think it sounds like you've done a lot of that throughout your career.
A lot of that, event production. I think one thing I'm really owning as my career title is I'm a creative producer. So I'm not just
Yes.
producing video, but I'm producing events. I'm actually planning a wellness retreat called Inspire, Rejuvenate, Live, that's
Mm-hmm.
targeted at Black professionals, creatives, and entrepreneurs. It's happening in Desert Hot Springs. So it's funny. From high school, I did student activities where I was hosting and planning all the student activities events. But at NYU, same thing. Me and my business partner,
Mm-hmm.
Kyle Gordon, like I said, is a co-founder, Move Up, Lift Up. We actually met doing events at NYU because there was such a lack of programming and activities for the Black student population there. And we saw the impact that it had on the experience of students and their ability to, be able to thrive there. It wasn't just like, doing events for the sake of, being cool guys, whatever. It was like, oh, we saw how important it was to the success of our students, but we also learned how to be entrepreneurs. So
Yes.
like, so, and again, at Tisch America at Harvard, I was doing event programming, but going to Google, and that is a funny story. Me and Kyle started about 3 months apart from each other. So, it's like one of your closest friends, go to this new company, that's like really big. And we're like, okay, we're here now, right? And we go to the Black History Month event in 2016, where this dude, Brian Stevenson, he's a very famous social justice advocate, came to speak to us. And he had an amazing speech where he talked about getting proximate to social justice. And it was, me and Kyle always joke about this because we were asked to volunteer for it. And, within 1 week, they're like, hey, Gerald, we want you to host a little after thing. I'm like, all right, like I just got here, sure, right? And then Kyle was doing a lot of operations in the back, and that's kind of the dynamic of our relationship, our business relationship. But we saw an opportunity. We're like, hey, like, this had a huge impact on Google's culture, this one event. And like me and you, we do events all the time. So we started taking over and doing events, through the Black Leader Network, not only the Black History Month one, but like we could do more, like, hosting holiday parties, that were geared towards Black employees, hosting different symposiums and panels. And that's what kind of led to SoulFest. But, for me, as a creative, like I like event production to me is like live storytelling. So I think there's that aspect of it. I think there's the mission of, like I said, community is like a big value of mine. But I think also the exposure piece, right? I think it's something that's really important to find success. And I think for me, it'll always be part of my career narrative. And, we love fete, you know what I'm saying? Like Caribbeans we love to, party. But I think part of it, I think one thing that is in service of kind of building family, building community, building trust is always part of it. So there's an underlying aspect of it. And, for me, through my company, Move Up, Lift Up, I'm always going to be trying to build community, empower people, create knowledge through that. Is just a key part, I think, of my kind of career narrative. And I think we just need to keep doing it.
Yes. And another part I wanted to highlight about your career journey that I think you and I sort of share is this notion of communicating. And there is this place in tech companies where there's a super technical people where you can't put them in front of someone. However, they could solve the hardest, ugliest technical challenges that possibly exist. And then there are people on the other side that keep them in a room full of people. They can navigate the room, do everything, and put them in any type of technology. They're like, nah, that's not happening. That's not their sort of calling or strength or whatever the case may be. And then there's the intersection where you are like that interface. And you mentioned that you were in sales. And I think not many people consider the backdoor route of sales, or the importance of having that ability to satisfy someone's needs for your company as a value add for a company. So can you kind of highlight that? And one of the other reasons I'm bringing this up is there's lots of companies out there. And I think over time, people will look to the Caribbean region as a talent pool to pull from. And it's not only the software engineers that can get hired, right? You can have so many different skill sets that can benefit a company, right?
No, I think that's so important. I'm glad you brought that up because my sales time was so much a deep dive into technology and advertising technology. So working with Netflix, man, Netflix is a really savvy tech company. Like, even though they're really savvy, I can't go too much into detail, but they push Google. Let me just put it like that. They push Google's kind of product teams to really step their game up in so many ways. But what I learned kind of managing that relationship, I was less of a salesperson. I was more of a consultant and really kind of like managing the kind of tech process that requires to essentially do advertising at scale. Like Netflix is, a global company and they're really trying to acquire customers across Asia, the Pacific, Africa, Middle East, Europe. So I really got to see some of the like analytics and the kind of strategy that's involved. And I got to sit in a lot of product meetings. Like I think, again, most sales folks, we're just selling the product, but like we're really helping shape the product.
Strategize for their market, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember just thinking, man, I'm in a meeting with all these product managers from Netflix and YouTube. Like, what's going on? Like, this is crazy. But it really, for me, help develop a really strong sense of like the role of technology and like shaping this. But like for me, like you said, it was my back door, right? No way I'm gonna ever be in meetings with product managers, right? Just coming for the most part, without a STEM degree, right? Like I have an arts degree, but I think taking the back door of sales and saying, hey, I really care about working with media companies and then find the most tech savvy media companies was my way in to get into some of those meetings and rooms with product managers, et cetera, where I'm learning about these platforms at a much deeper level, right? And really getting that experience, right? Which I think is going to be instrumental because, I want to run the studios of the future, right? And the studios of the future, technology is built in. I think another aspect of that too was my business partnership with Kyle, because he studied like a typical Caribbean fam. He's studied engineering and math in undergrad.
You
while I
have
was at
to. Otherwise,
Yeah,
like,
exactly. And so again, like, we have this kind of mutual understanding where like, hey, like I studied the arts, you studied math, but we have this shared vision around the role of creativity and technology, right? And so there's this overlap where we can learn from each other and kind of bounce ideas off each other. Like, hey, I have this creative idea. Like, oh, there's this piece of technology. Have you thought about that? So I think those conversations too, I think are important. And that's, I think that, and you talked about this too. You have technologists, people, who are building it. You have these creatives. I try to sit here. We're like, hey, how do we talk to each other? How do we talk to each other?
And that's a big, it's a hard place to be in for everybody, but I think it's something you should pay attention to. If you find technology very, you're very curious about technology, but you're also very curious about people, there is I think a very valuable place for you within companies. So I just wanted to make sure that particular career path is there for those that are listening. I don't care what stage of your profession you're at, you can always sort of sneak in to different places.
100%. I really want to highlight that for the audience that like, you do not have to have a STEM degree to work at a tech company. Again, I'm an example of that in so many ways. And I think technologists realize the importance of creativity in the workflow, and they're seeing that. And the ability to communicate to both stakeholders is, to me, some of the most valuable opportunities. Steve Stout, I just listened to a podcast with him. He really stresses this. A lot of the big leaders in music, film, culture, all understand that intersection. And so that is a huge path for a lot of people.
Yeah, it was funny enough. As we're talking about creativity, I think I watched a documentary on creativity last night. So it got me kind of primed for this discussion. And there was a scientist who, she looked at the toys, and I guess there was a toy back in the 60s where it was this big piece of plastic. When you put it in the oven, it'll shrink down and be like this really, really tiny plate. So she's in nanotechnology, and the current approach of creating very, very small, intricate pieces of hardware is you go do construction on a micro level, right? However, she said she looked at that toy that she grew up with and said, hold up. Why are we operating at this? Why are we trying to do manipulations at this small level? Let's do manipulations at this big level and then just shrink down. So her research just takes, you build your hardware at this level and you shrink down to a smaller level to the nano size that you need. And it's quite an interesting use case for creativity. And that was what they were trying to highlight. Like, you can't just approach the problem just from your sort of linear thinking. So at least for the engineers listening, I think there's great benefit in you exploring your creative side, even if it has absolutely nothing to do with what you're working on as well. So can you comment on that? How you...
Yeah, no, I hear you. And one of the things I love about what you're saying, it sounds like it's this idea that there's a hierarchy of knowledge that we have to kind of erase in some of these processes where like we have to say, like, hey, yes, you are an expert in building this thing, which is very complex. Like, I want to make that very clear. But when you look at the artists of today that are really popular, they are building very complex cultural ecosystems, right? That require deep expertise too, right? And so if we start to look at each other from not a place of like, I'm here and you're here, of like, no, we are in these two different planes. How do we learn from each other, right? I think there will be a huge piece, but something that Kyle talks about a lot that I really, really respect, and some of the work he's doing, he's going to be working in the media lab at MIT, is how do we bring in creatives in the design process of products, right? Like,
yes.
when you think about how products are developed, they go through all these kind of testing and iterations, right? And I'm talking to some companies that have new products too, but how do we make sure that creatives are actually at that table influencing that, right? Because again, there's so many examples when someone releases and there's so many stories of like tech companies getting ripped in the media from like releasing a product that does something that like, incorrectly, tags, a Black person or is not used or is like a failure, right? And so many of those things can be,
mitigated essentially.
Yeah, exactly, mitigated. But also so many things can find like new levels of success, right? And I think Travis Scott's like someone who I'm seeing who's really integrating technology in a really interesting way, like Fortnite, and the stickiness of gaming overall. They get it. They understand that the power of intellectual property, the power of new edgy technology, and how they come together and how you have to kind of sit with it. But I think to me, one of the big things, and I have so many event ideas around how we can bring these two stakeholders together, around creatives and technologists, to have more of a like kind of consistent dialogue around how creativity can enhance technology. And I think if you look at, to me, why I'm the most excited about for this next decade and why I wanted to be in LA specifically is I think, technology takes on different areas and really enhances it, right? So it kind of enhanced the publishing industry and like how we engage in kind of print media. It's going to impact health. It's going to impact automobiles. It's doing all these things. But to me, it's the heyday of entertainment and technology. Yes. Where I remember when I started working on the Netflix and Hulu account, 5 different streamers came into that. You see all these traditional companies moving into streaming, right? So they're having to figure out their tech backend. They're trying to figure out their strategy, right? You're seeing the enhancement. The pandemic happened, so then how we have to receive, media is changing. We have these new things like Clubhouse. You have new live streaming technologies. You have things like Versus. So this is to me, we're gonna go back and say, hey, the late 2010s, early 2020s is a true shift in how we engage in media. Like it's almost like when film went from black and white to color, when film had sound for the first time, when we had television kind of come, like I think this era of that really great transition of legacy media into new media platforms, with TikTok, all of these things, like I think this is a very unique time in that history, and I'm excited to kind of be in the mix right now and figure that out. But I think whoever figures out how to make like interesting entertainment and very fun entertainment through that is gonna win. I think that's gonna be the winner. Like when the dust is settled, I think that's gonna be where we're gonna see that transformation happen.
Interesting entertainment. I like that. And I had this idea a couple of years ago, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago, about ad TV. So I'm super interested in advertising. It's quite a fascinating thing to understand how you target someone and just the whole production aspect and the emotions that you want to invoke in someone in a very, very short period of time. And it kind of resonates with what you're saying in terms of there's going to be this intersection of, I don't think you'll know when you're watching TV very much later on. It'll just be like, things are happening. And all of a sudden, I always thought it would have been cool where, like, if you look at the show Friends, I never really watched it too much, but imagine every single sort of take or every single slice of that particular show had embedded in it an advertisement. So like, I'm drinking a Sprite today, or I opened this fridge, it's from GE, and I'm carrying this Dolce & Gabbana purse. I don't know anything about purses, but you know what I mean. And do you sort of see that intersection of companies influencing us through native media versus interrupting the native media? Are you privy to anything better?
I totally hear where you're going. I'm super excited you brought this up because this is a conversation I would have a lot. What you're talking about, this concept of organic or kind of publisher kind of content from brands versus paid advertisement. And I think there's an intersection. I want to use your Friends example because I think that's actually really good, right? Imagine a world, right, where you're watching an episode of Friends, or let's say any popular show, let's say Insecure, right? And the car that someone's driving in a character changes based on the viewer data of the person watching it, right? And so they're able to like create dynamic ad insertion, based on the viewing data of the person watching it, where the painting that's in the back changes, the bag that someone's changes, right? This is why like Black Mirror Bandersnatch to me is like really fascinating. These kind of concepts that like you're gonna get a different story based on who you are. And I think this is where Quibi, I don't know if you remember Quibi, it was supposed to be this mobile video revolution, right? That happened. And it released April 1st, 2020. So right at the beginning of the pandemic, just terrible timing. But essentially it failed for a lot of reasons, and there's a lot of things that talked about it. But the thing that I'm really, really interested in from a advertising and brand perspective is this concept of personalization, right? Based on kind of viewer and demographic data, and this hyper targeting that can exist with that. Which is controversial and interesting, but I think storytelling is a big part of it. I did a lot of creative experimentation when I was on the Netflix account and what I'm doing, and I think there's a lot of A/B testing that's happening around different messaging. But I think when we give storytellers the ability to say, hey, shoot this 10 different ways. So there's another thing I'm studying. I'm blanking on the name of what it's called, but like AI in post-production, where you
Yes.
just shoot 10 different versions of something, and the AI will essentially, and you kind of give it essentially like a
bunch of different prompts and stuff like that. Yeah.
Prompts, exactly right. You say, hey, I have an intro that does this, have a actor that does this, and it literally places it for you. And then you can create 3 different versions. Like, hey, I want one that's going to appeal to this demographic, to that demographic. It's going to change the whole production process, where how we shoot, what we do. It was a Stanford PhD researcher who was doing the presentation around it. I was like, wow, that's going to change how we even think about shooting and creating. And I think for advertising, for brands, what they need to figure out, because they're right, there's this a concept of publisher brands, and like you're seeing all these publisher brands like Vogue, GQ, like create YouTube channels, and they have these huge YouTube followers where they're doing all their stuff visually. But I think when it comes to paid advertising, engage in, actual like narrative storytelling, I think it's going to be these dynamic ad insertions that are going to be, I think, a huge opportunity. And how it's shot and how it's done.
Yes.
Super excited. Yeah.
And you brought up a topic I actually wanted to ask you about is this notion of generative script writing. So at least from an NLP, natural language processing perspective, there are models now, and that I do believe Netflix is actually using it. I don't know if they said it publicly, but at least you can read it in some papers where you're generating entire movie scripts based off of a couple of prompts, right? I want this character, this person had 3 kids and they lost a wife, blah, blah, blah. And it generates a story. And that's all like a prompt for someone to sort of navigate and tighten up or giving you new ideas. Do you see a lot of creatives leveraging machine learning as an extra like prod? Hey, you give me all of this. Let me put it together and give you a suggestion. Do you see that being used as part of the process?
No, not at all. And when I'm kind of riffing off this, and this is such a dope idea because I love improv, right? And so improv is an analog version of what you're talking about, right? Where you give a group of actors a prompt, a situation, and they kind of in the moment do something and they try different things. And this is how a lot of great comedy films are shot. A lot of great comedy films are like, all right, here's the setting. You try different things, right? And then in the edit room, people don't know this. Like a lot of your favorite comedy films, it required a really, really talented actor who can really just rip and just a situational. And they would try, so they'll say, okay, let's do this version where you realize that she did this or this person did that, right? Okay, now let's change the circumstance, right? Like a lot of people, again, this is something as like a director. This is what my filmmaking.
I have no clue.
I really always enjoy it. And think about that. Think about the connection technology that has, right? And then in the edit room, you guys we pull what the best take is. Again, in your example, we could actually just have again, using AI, et cetera, kind of like do these different takes, do these different situations, and it can pull and mix and match stories. And who knows, right? Because I think one of the things I want to be careful about is I don't think, artificial intelligence will replace the writing process.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
But I think what it can enhance is it can create new versions of things that like would have maybe can be enhanced, right? Where like now, as a director, I'm like, I just want I don't even need a full script. I just maybe need a couple bullet points, a couple situations, really do character deep dives and say, hey, like, let's really just examine your character. Let's understand what your character would say, right? And then really set that in. And now let's just run with it. Now the speed in which I can produce can be way higher, right? Because the writing process is so complex. Getting people to get their lines right is so complex, right? So then now we can kind of do that. Then we have like multiple outputs, right? And then we can test, hey, like, let's maybe there's 5 different episodes of different versions of the episode, and we can test to see which one performs well. Like there's so many different things that we can do that I'm really excited about from a production standpoint.
Huh. So YouTube, this might be a weird question, but do you consider YouTube to be a tech company or a video company?
Oh, it's definitely a tech company. It's for sure a tech company that hosts videos. And you see that in so many ways, and just like again, the platform just expansively, just how the platform is built and the architecture is just so complex,
Yes.
But I think one thing, I'll say this though, I saw a documentary about MTV and the creation of MTV, and I always tell people that MTV was like a preconception of YouTube. It was an early version of YouTube, right? Because it had all these like not only just music videos, but kind of different kind of forms of media that were being created, right? It was dynamic. It was like, there's so many things that you could kind of switch between, et cetera. And it used cable was a media technology of its time. But I think YouTube is also still very much like a media platform, right? That's just, but it's multiple media platforms. I think that's like, and I went to a talk with Susan Wojcicki where she talked about like, hey, we are trying to house multiple media platforms, not just media channels, media platforms, right? On, within the YouTube universe. And I think that to me is something that was really interesting, that, the technology can essentially, like, if you think about it, like you had maybe 60 channels when you're watching cable, right? Obviously there's millions of YouTube channels, right, that exist now. But like I think the power of the technology is like finding what those networks are for you, right? And shaping how your YouTube looks as a result of that, to me, is the most interesting part of it. And I think that's, to me, what makes it incredibly special. Is like once you build out your YouTube profile, like how it looks like, it's such a, and we talk about this, like, like personal prime time is something that like Susan talks about a lot. And I think that's something to me that's really interesting.
Personal prime time. Okay. I wanted to ask, you're a creative person and you're a creative director. Yeah. To some degree, I imagine you measure the success of your creation based on some type of feedback. And this question, or this particular, call it statement, is maybe geared to maybe people who produce content, let's say on YouTube or just content generators in general, where there's this notion of expression versus virality. So am I doing this to try to go viral? Am I doing this to express myself? Naturally, every single person, I think, is now conditioned to, hey, I want my expression to be viral. But I think this is a great place for both the creative and the technology component, right? And what would you say to creators around this notion of expression versus expressing for virality, or just expression for the creative process?
You're asking fantastic questions. Like, really, these are the questions like I get excited about. And so I went to NYU, which is like a very, very highbrow art school, right? Like, very much, there's so much of value around the culture of storytelling that we were never told, you got to be a big movie director, successful. Like, we were told, don't worry about the big successful directors. You want to be the director or the filmmaker that's respected, right? That like, people know that it's like really, really creating high art. But a lot of times those people don't make a lot of money. I'm not saying that that should be the goal. Like, if you really love the art of storytelling, like that should be a value. But let's also understand that this is a business, right? Like, the goal is to also make money. And I think a lot of like, people who went to film school actually are like kind of in this weird place of like, hey, like I'm seeing all these content creators on TikTok make these very actually innovative stories, and they're getting viral and they're making whole careers off this in a way that I can't right now. Like I have this like, 2-hour, experimental movie, right, which can't be sold, where it's like, has a small audience, all of these things. And so there is this conflict between kind of, creative expression and virality. And, it's always existed. I think it was this different conversation. There was commercialism versus independent. There's always this kind of dynamic of like, mass production and the means for mass production, and like kind of this idea of like boundary pushing art. But I'm gonna have a lot of cautions around virality though, and how it can impact the creative process, right? Because what happens is, if you are only chasing virality, right, and like kind of like these kind of mass, shared things, you're gonna have a lot of the same iterative creativity. Where things are gonna feel the same, sound the same, be the same, and then and I think the shelf life of creativity, of creative projects, whether that be music, film, is much shorter, right? Because people kind of suck it out very quickly, the juices of it, versus where, I listen to stuff from the 80s and 90s that like still resonate today, right? So how do we make things special in this kind of era where everything is accessible, everything's available to us now, things are produced fast, right? And so, artists for me, like, Frank Ocean, are really important, right? Because he's someone he very much cares about technology. He very much integrates that in his work, but he's very selective in how he releases his content, and it lasts for a long time, right? I understand that it's not for everyone. I understand that that's not something everyone wants to listen to every day, versus, there might be other genres where someone drops the album yesterday and then people forget about it 2 weeks from later, right? And they have their spike in their interest, and then it kind of dips. But I think what I want to caution about that for how that can impact creativity is that, again, things can get old really quick. People are not going to maybe push boundaries. People are not going to take risk in the same way because they're chasing the numbers. But I think what we have to do better as creatives is figure out how to properly, and I struggle with this now, how to analyze the effectiveness of creativity, right? So there could be different, creative means that are actually reaching certain goals, but we're just not measuring it properly, right? It's influencing a new audience, it's creating a new audience, in different ways, right?
Baby, lunch is ready.
So, yeah, I have to go soon to eat food with my lady. How we navigate some of these different, measuring some of these different things are going to be really, really, really like critical for the way in which we're going to keep things expansive, right? So that's what I want to sit on. It's like, hey, how do we make things that can go viral, but that can be really, really innovative, boundary pushing, interesting, right? And not falling into the same mold. And so how we do that, I think, is some of my life's work, essentially.
Gotcha, man. All right. So as we move to wrap up there, I gotta go on and make sure I eat there, no?
Yeah, yes, sir.
All right. So you're very passionate about your field in creation. And what 2 pieces of advice would you give to someone in high school, someone in college, and a professional?
Perfect. In high school, I would say focus on learning as much as possible and setting yourself up to have as many options as possible so that you can, whether that's going to college, producing for yourself, etc. In college, take as many risks. Like that is the time where you take risks, especially using the resources of your institution and try new things. As a professional, I think the thing I would say is think about yourself as a business. Think about yourself, even if you're working in a corporation, think about yourself as an entrepreneur to maximize your opportunities and really understand that you have a long career. Your career can change every day. Understood.
And what are 3 principles you live by?
I think my business principles, which are the principles that move up, lift up. Everybody eats. We all can, really be creative. It's all about progression. It's like we have to keep moving forward. We can't settle. We have to keep going. And come under the umbrella and don't get rained on. Let's really support each other.
Wow.
As much as possible. And so those are my business philosophies that I live by.
The last one, I like that.
These are all rap lyrics too, by the way. And so Jay-Z, Dame Dash, and we took all of them, and that's our philosophy.
Hey man, and you live it. That's the most important thing, right? And the last one, what are 3 books you recommend?
No, perfect. I actually have them right here. Actually, one of them. So speaking about media and technology, the medium is The Massage. It's it's filmed in the 70s. It really talks about how technology shapes communication in so many ways. And so it's ahead of its time. There's a couple actually. It's by Tim Wu. Let me actually look it up right now. There's 2 books by Tim Wu that I would say, I'm looking them up right now. So the Tisch Merchants, by Tim Wu.
Merchants.
Yep. And the last one is The Master Switch. Probably one of the most important books I read. And it's about covering all the different changes in time around communication technology.
Okay.
Telegraph, radio, television, the internet. So those 3 books: The Medium is The Massage, The Tisch Merchants, and The Master Switch.
Perfect, man. And once again, I appreciate your time, and hopefully people from your region especially find some inspiration in your story, and thanks for contributing.
Of course. Let me know if you need anything else. I really appreciate this. This is fabulous. Thank you.
Absolutely. Have a good one, man. Later.
All right. Take care. Bye.